Good evening, and welcome to ISAC, to our February monthly lecture. We have a very special event this evening, and something that it's a first for me to witness a lecture where we will have two presentations that are working together on a common topic, coming out of one of our ongoing collaborations. This year we've been featuring in various other contexts. This is the first of our lectures where we have brought together the partners that we are collaborating with at the National Hellenic Museum. And so we're very happy to welcome everyone who is here perhaps from that community. And we look forward to the lecture this evening. Let me say a little bit about our speakers before we move to the topic. Dr. Katherine Kelaidis, who is the Director of Research and Content at the National Hellenic Museum, will be speaking. Just to give you some introduction to her, she is earned her BA in Classics from the University of California at Berkeley, and then subsequently went on to the University of London, where she earned her PhD also in Classics. And that was in 2016, and since then she has been, as I understand it, at the National Hellenic Museum here in Chicago. She has a remarkable publication record, but I want to read to you some of the titles of her monographs, including forthcoming. I was really, as I was looking through her CV earlier today, she has a very extensive publication record, but just speaking only about monographs, she has a book that has just come out most recently on Holy Russia, Holy War, the Orthodox history behind Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Obviously a very timely subject. But she also has forthcoming, and this is the part that I find remarkable, if I may say, she has also monographs that are due and forthcoming over the next year or two. I count here 4. One is on Saving Jesus, Soteriology and Popular Culture with Fortress Press. The second one is the Fourth Reformation, Understanding the Religious Chaos of Our Time. And third, Mere Superstition, Folk Magic and Liturgical Reform in Modern Orthodox Christianity. And that's part of the Cambridge Elements series and that theme. And then fourthly, In the Footsteps of the Emperor, Manuel II, Leagus. I'm going to have a hard time pronouncing this. That person, his journey to the West. And hopefully this gives you a sense of her scholarship. She's both working extensively on studying the historical narratives from the Eastern Christian traditions and bringing them into particularly discourse with their diaspora. And so this literature and this research really speaks to that. But she also has extensive engagement with even a broader popular or public audience as a senior editor in Religion Dispatches. She has also published in The Atlantic, The Spectator, and Salon. So a really interesting and broad range of scholarship, and we look forward to her part of the presentation this evening. Secondly, and I will introduce now and will invite to the podium in a minute, my colleague Brian Muhs is the professor of Egyptology here at ISAC and has been here since about 2011. Prior to his coming to the Institute, he was at Leiden, where he was a lecturer following his doctoral studies at the University of Pennsylvania, completed in 1996. Brian has a wide range of scholarship, but I want to emphasize particularly his work on economics and legal traditions within the late period, primarily in ancient Egypt. He has published extensively, more than 70 articles, I count more than 5 monographs, and then also multiple volumes that are co-authored or co-edited. Brian's scholarship has focused on studying economic texts, in particular things like tax receipts and other kinds of legal and economic documents, and mining them for really interesting and important studies of the economic systems of particularly late and Ptolemaic Egypt. His most recent volume, just to give you a flavor of the titles of some of these, which just came out this past year, it's a really monumental piece of scholarship entitled Lending in Ptolemaic Egypt, the Demotic Loan Account Papyrus or Papyri of Panias, son of Espamidas. So with that kind of a background, I think we have really two top scholars this evening who are going to bring us this kind of joint lecture on the topic, a very timely subject, tonight on ancient Greek immigration. So let me invite, I think, first Brian to the podium, and if you could join me in welcoming him to give us on our way on the topic of Greek immigration, literature, and identity in ancient Egypt. Ancient and modern. Brian, please.
Thank you for that kind introduction, and I appreciate the reference to tax receipts. You will see a couple of them tonight. You can't escape them. Can't escape taxes. All right, let's see. Greeks have immigrated to Egypt from at least the 7th century BCE onwards, if not earlier, and Greek immigrants to ancient Egypt naturally considered Greek language and literature to be part of their shared identity. Greek language and literature were not exclusive to Greeks, however. Ancient Egyptians also learned Greek and heard, read, and wrote Greek literature, even as some Greeks learned Egyptian and translated their stories and literature into Greek. In this lecture, I will focus on Greek immigrants to Egypt in the late Pharaonic and Ptolemaic periods, roughly from the 7th to the 1st centuries BCE. Obviously, there are Greek speakers in Egypt in the Roman and Byzantine periods and beyond, and later immigrants. But by that time, there had been this Greek-speaking community in Egypt for many centuries. So it's a very different dynamic than you have in these earlier periods. In the 7th century BCE, King Gyges of Lydia in western Anatolia persuaded a large number of Ionian Greeks and Carians from the neighboring coastal cities to immigrate to Egypt. They become mercenaries for King Psammetichus of Sais, who employed them to reunite Egypt under his rule. Later, his grandson, King Psammetichus II, employed them on a campaign in 592 BCE against the kingdom of Nubia to the south of Egypt. On that campaign, one mercenary left a Greek graffito at Abu Simbel. The inscription is located on the knee of one of the 4 colossal rock-cut statues of Ramses II at Abu Simbel. The inscription commemorates Psammetichus II and his commanders, and then states, Archon, son of Amoibikos, wrote us, and Pelikos, son of Udamos. Now, many have taken this statement at face value to indicate the inscription had 2 authors, Amoibikos and Pelikos. It has been suggested, however, that this might be a pun, since Pelikos is a word for axe, and Udamos can be understood as no one. If so, it could reference the Odyssey, Book 9, line 366, where Odysseus tells the Cyclops Polyphemus that his name is Utis, no one. So perhaps Greek mercenary in Egypt is sharing this Homeric joke with passerbys who can read Greek. The Persians conquered Egypt and added it to their empire in 525 BCE, but Greeks continued to travel to and to trade with Egypt through the port of Heraklion and the town of Naucratis in the delta of Egypt. The town of Heraklion, called Tonis in Egyptian, was probably the main port of Egypt in the Sayyid and Persian periods, though certainly not the only one. It was built on a series of islands at the mouth of the Canopic branch of the Nile, and it sank into the sea in the 8th century CE. It was then largely forgotten, apart from a few references by classical authors, until Frank Gaudio's underwater excavations there began in 2000. Among many other things, he found an Egyptian stela decreeing customs duties, one of my favorite topics, on all ships entering Egypt through the port. Hence, I had to include a picture of it. The town of Naucratis was the main settlement of Greek merchants in Sayet in Persian Egypt. It was located on the Canopic branch of the Nile upstream from Herakleion Tonis. It was excavated by Petrie in 1886. He identified the Greek sanctuaries in the northern part of the town, but misunderstood the large enclosure in the southern part of the town as a fortress. 30 years ago, I suggested it was actually an Egyptian temple to the god Amun, and recent work by the British Museum Naucratis Project has supported that interpretation, as seen in the reconstruction here. Another Egyptian stela decreeing customs duties on ships was found in the temple in 1886, which turned out to be nearly identical to the one more recently found at Herakleion Tonis, so they were a pair. Now, the Greek historian Herodotus may have passed through Herakleion and Naucratis when he visited Egypt in the 5th century BCE. He wrote Greek versions of Egyptian stories told to him as histories by Egyptian priests, including the Pharaoh story in Herodotus Book 2, 111, which is also survived in Demotic Egyptian on fragments from a temple library at Tebtunis from the 1st or 2nd century CE. Through Herodotus, these Egyptian stories became part of the Greek literary tradition and canon. Now, since I don't expect you to read all of that, the Pharaoh story tells how a king named Pharaoh, obviously a misunderstanding of the Egyptian title Pharaoh, became blind. He was advised to wash his eyes in the urine of a woman who had never betrayed her husband. After many trials, the king was successful, and of course he married the woman who cured him, and he had all the others killed and burned. The Egyptian version substitutes tears for urine, but otherwise tells the same story. So in this way, Egyptian stories are entering into the Greek literary tradition. Alexander conquered Egypt in 332 BCE, and he founded the city of Alexandria in 331 before continuing his campaign against the Persian Empire. The Egyptian name for the city, Rakotis, means place of building, which has led modern scholars to speculate whether there was already an Egyptian settlement on the site or not. I suspect that there was, but the main port of Egypt was probably located down the coast at Herakleion until it was superseded by Alexandria. Alexander's general Ptolemy seized Egypt after Alexander's death in 323 BCE. He initially ruled as satrap for Alexander's heirs, even after they had all died, until he proclaimed himself as king in 305 BCE. Ptolemy's son, Ptolemy II, stimulated the growth of Alexandria, in part by building a navy of over 300 warships, which would have been crewed by about 60,000 sailors, many of whom would have been based at Alexandria. He also built the Pharos, or lighthouse of Alexandria, or at least finished it, since some ancient sources attribute it to his father. Like Herakleion Tonis, the lighthouse has since sunk into the sea. Ptolemy II probably also founded the Library of Alexandria, located near the royal palace in the main harbor of Alexandria. Again, one ancient source attributes it to his father, Ptolemy I, with Demetrius of Phaleron as librarian, but no other source supports this. Everyone else says it's Ptolemy II. Ptolemy II purchased manuscripts for his library from all over the Greek world and seized manuscripts from ships that came to Alexandria and replaced them with copies. As a result, it quickly became a center for Greek scholarship. The librarians and other staff were particularly concerned with standardizing the texts of Homer, which varied wildly, and they developed a system of diacritics and commentaries, particularly for the texts of Homer again, which were the main text used for teaching Greek. And I've here outlined, these are a list of librarians and poets at Alexandria, and I've highlighted the ones who did grammatical studies. Here's a fragment of a text of Homer in ISAC Museum, right next door, from Egypt and dating to the Roman period. It is written in a neat bookhand, typical of ancient Greek literary texts, and it contains some diacritics, like those developed in Egypt. I don't know, yeah, you should be able to see them. Oh, can you see the, no, you can't see the cursor. Oh well. You may be able to see on the papyrus there's some accent marks there and a couple of other dots indicating pronunciation, and you can see it much clearer on the transcription up there. The presence of the library at Alexandria also inspired Ptolemaic court poets like Apollonius, Callimachus, and Theocritus to compose extremely erudite poetry filled with references and allusions to earlier Greek literary works, which were readily and conveniently at hand in the library. This style of poetry is sometimes described as Alexandrian, which incidentally is also used to describe the poetry of Cavafy, such as his poem about the priest of the Serapeum depicted here. And by the way, you can contrast the modern cursive Greek used by Cavafy with the Greek bookhands used by the ancient Greeks. Scholarly work at the library largely ended in 145 BCE, when Ptolemy VIII expelled foreign scholars whom he felt were critical of him. It was already more of a symbol of learning than a center of it when Julius Caesar accidentally burned the library in 48 BC. Well, you know, yeah. So Ptolemy I and Ptolemy II also encouraged Greeks to immigrate to the Egyptian countryside, not just to Alexandria. And there they received land to farm in return for serving as militia soldiers when called up. There were at least 36,000 of these soldiers called clerics. Ptolemy I founded a new city, Ptolemais, in southern Egypt, but Ptolemy II settled many of the clerics in the Fayum, where much land was being brought under agriculture through an expansion of canal networks. Many of the Greek papyri from the Egyptian countryside were found in the Fayum, both because many Greeks settled there, but also because many of their settlements were abandoned and reclaimed by the desert after the canal networks failed. In addition to Greek immigration, the Ptolemies also encouraged the teaching of Greek in the countryside. We know that the Ptolemies subsidized Greek teachers from Greek and Demotic Egyptian census lists, which listed all of the millions of inhabitants of Egypt by their community, their household, and their profession for the purposes of calculating taxes. Unfortunately, at least for me, we only have fragments of these census lists. And again, most of them come from the Fayum. I picked one here, which was fragments were preserved by being reused to make cartonnage or paper mache mummy masks and mummy cases. And this one, on one side, you have the Demotic, yes, which is on the left side, and the Greek is on the right side. Some professions on these lists were privileged and paid less taxes, and one of those professions were teachers of Greek. Another privileged category were victors in Greek contests, sport contests, well, also musical contests. So it seems clear that the Ptolemies tried to stimulate Greek culture in Egypt through fiscal incentives. We can track, and here we have the tax receipts. We can track the effectiveness of the Ptolemies' tax incentives for teaching Greek through Greek tax receipts issued to Egyptian taxpayers. To produce hundreds of thousands of tax receipts each year, tax collectors recruited Egyptian scribes to help with this enormous task. And their dated receipts demonstrate their knowledge of the Greek language. For example, the Egyptian language does not have declensional endings, but receipts written in good Greek should add declensional endings to Egyptian names. The earliest Greek tax receipts from Egypt, which start around 265 BCE, did not add endings to Egyptian names and simply wrote them phonetically like the one illustrated here. So, as you can see, the Greek thoteu pa pehib is probably an accurate representation of how the Demotic Egyptian name Jehuti iu sa paheb was actually pronounced. Of course, in good Greek, we expect something like Thaudius Phibios, or Pahibius, I mean, because it's not a phi sound yet. The Egyptian scribe who wrote the previous receipt wrote another tax receipt for the same Egyptian taxpayer the following year. And this time, he declined the Egyptian names perfectly. Clearly, he was a quick learner. He was not alone, however. By about 245 BCE, standardized Greek spellings of Egyptian names with regular declensions had become the norm in Egypt. Presumably, this represents the success of 20 years of state-subsidized Greek teaching in the Egyptian countryside. After learning the alphabet and Greek grammar, advanced education in the Egyptian countryside focused on reading and copying Homer, and more copies of Homer have survived from Egypt than any other Greek literary text. Far fewer copies of Homer has survived from Ptolemaic Egypt than from Roman Egypt, but the number of variant readings in the Ptolemaic text declines through time, perhaps attesting to the success of the librarians at the Library of Alexandria in standardizing the texts of Homer. And here I've shown the same example from our collection. Greek literature, and particularly Homer, was a source of identity for literate Greeks in Egypt. But it was also a very inclusive and cosmopolitan form of identity, also open to the many Egyptians who chose to learn and write in Greek in Ptolemaic Egypt. Such Egyptians were inevitably exposed to Homer as part of their education, and some chose, consciously or unconsciously, to incorporate elements of it in their own Demotic Egyptian literature. One relatively clear example occurs in the Demotic Egyptian literary text, The Battle for the Armor of Inaros, which recounts a heroic period in Egyptian history prior to the reunification of Egypt by Psammetichus I with the help of his Greek and Carian mercenaries. In the 14th column of this text, depicted here, it catalogs the arrival of warring lords with their soldiers and their ships at a battlefield, which echoes very closely the similar list of ships in Book 2 of the Iliad. This text dates to the Roman period, specifically to 137 or 138 CE, but other parts of the story date back to the Ptolemaic period at least. Some Egyptians literate in Greek composed texts that entered into the Greek literary tradition. An Egyptian priest named Manetho of Sabinitos wrote a history of Egypt in Greek called the Egyptaica in the early 3rd century BCE, possibly at the request of Ptolemy I or II. It divided Egyptian history into 30 dynasties, which are still used today. Multiple copies of it were available around the Roman Empire, and the historians Flavius Josephus, Sextus Julius Africanus, Eusebius of Caesarea, and George Syncellus included quotations or summaries from it in their histories. The Egyptaica was one of the many ancient Greek works that ceased to be copied in the Byzantine period, and so disappeared. But the quotations and summaries in Josephus, Africanus, Eusebius, and Syncellus survived, and were used by early Egyptologists to identify the names in cartouches as Egyptian kings and to place them in their proper sequence in history. At the same time, some Greeks learned Egyptian and incorporated Egyptian stories into their Greek writings. Fragments of an Egyptian story written in Demotic Egyptian describe how the last indigenous pharaoh of Egypt, Nectanebo II, realized that his country would be conquered by the Persians as a sort of fulfilling of a curse against him by the gods. So he fled to Macedonia, where he secretly became the father of Alexander the Great, who would avenge him by conquering the Persians. The fragments of the story come from a temple library at Tunis and date to the 1st or 2nd century CE and are now in Copenhagen. There is, however, a better preserved version of the story in Greek called, okay, I'm going to, getting a message here, which I'm going to decline. So there's a better preserved version of this story in Greek called The Dream of Nectanebo, which is preserved on a Greek papyrus from the Serapeum at Saqqara, dating to the 2nd century BCE, and is depicted here. The Greek papyrus is older than the Demotic fragments, but it is generally believed to be a translation of an Egyptian story, since it was written by a Greek named Apollonius, who left it with the papyri of his brother Ptolemaeus, who lived in the Egyptian temple at Saqqara. In this story, Nectanebo II hires the fastest hieroglyph cutter in Egypt to decorate an Egyptian temple in order to appease the gods and hopefully avoid the fate that Egypt's going to be punished by being conquered by the Persians. The hieroglyph carver is, however, distracted in the process of decorating the temple by a pretty woman. So the project fails, and Nectanebo has to flee to avoid the Persians. Apollonius, the translator, was apparently also distracted because he left the story unfinished, except for a doodle of a pretty woman, exactly at the spot where the pretty woman appears in the story. Other Greek versions of the story presumably circulated widely, because in the later Latin romance of Alexander, it also claims that Nectanebo II was the secret father of Alexander the Great. In this way, an Egyptian story became part of the Greek literary tradition, like the Egyptian stories written by Herodotus centuries earlier. In this lecture, I've acknowledged that Greek language and literature were part of the identity of Greek immigrants to ancient Egypt. But in addition, I've tried to suggest that Greek literature also transcended that identity. The Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt tried to standardize and canonize Greek literature at the Library of Alexandria, but they also encouraged the teaching of Greek in the Egyptian countryside. Egyptians learned Greek and read Greek literature, and it influenced their stories, even as Greeks and Egyptians introduced Egyptian stories into Greek literature. And with that, my story is done, and I will just set it up for our next speaker, Katherine Kelaidis. There we go.
Oh, what do I need to do?
One last button.
Okay. So there's always one last button. Oh, perfect.
And that. Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. And I'm a little bit short. So I have been given the task of thanking ISAC for inviting us here today. And also I have to thank our education manager, Elena Contreras, who has created the Museums in Conversation program. So thank you. Her sheer force of will. Also, before I get started, let me see if I can get this out of the way. Also, before I get started, I want to mention, I'm not heavy on biography of Cavafy tonight, but if you're interested in biography of Cavafy, there is an excellent new biography that came out late last year by Gregory Udanis and Peter Jeffries. This has benefited from access to papers of Cavafy that were not previously available. So if you're interested in sort of a more robust sort of biographical treatment of Cavafy, I cannot recommend this book enough. So that's my pitch for their work. Tonight, though, I want to talk about Cavafy not only as the most famous poet to write in modern Greek, which certainly outside of the Greek-speaking world he is undeniably, but also as the herald of a cosmopolitan Hellenism. That is a way of expressing, celebrating, and thinking about Greek language, history, and culture in all its incarnations that resists the parochialism and nationalism that's sometimes found in Greek and Greek diaspora circles, as well as the elitism and reactionary spirit that hovers above the classical tradition all over the world. This cosmopolitan Hellenism is a paradigm that, while maintaining a distinctly and unapologetically Greek or Hellenic quality, is open to new experiences and people, and in fact understands Hellenism as fundamentally an experience of encounter, migration, exchange, and dialogue. In short, I want to ask what Cavafy, a poet whom I've loved and learned from since I was a child, has to say about what I believe is the most pressing question of our era. How do we live peacefully and productively with people who are different from us? People who think and behave and believe in ways that are not only not like us, but in some instances fundamentally offensive to us. So before I go further, I want to talk a bit about cosmopolitanism. I am contractually and ancestrally obligated to mention that it emerged in ancient Greece, according to tradition, with the philosopher Diogenes of Sinope, who famously decided to live in a terracotta pot, so he would not want for anything. He was ahead of the housing market before any of us, who is said to have coined the term cosmopolitan, using the word for polites, a citizen, and cosmos, creating a word that would have sounded like an oxymoron to ancient ears. To be a citizen, after all, was to belong to a specific city, a specific community. But Diogenes used the word to suggest the idea that all human beings, regardless of the other communities we might belong to, also belonged to a single community, a global polis. And as such, we all owe a certain level of respect and have certain responsibilities to each other. Furthermore, my thinking on modern cosmopolitanism has been greatly shaped, I think, by just like anyone who thinks about these topics, by Kwame Anthony Appiah, the contemporary philosopher whose 2006 book, Cosmopolitanism, Ethics in the World of Strangers, is required reading as far as I'm concerned. And if you take one of my classes, it is required reading. Which does go to the point that I'm obviously not the only person thinking about these issues, about how we live together. But I do think there is a problem with the historical subtext with which this question is often asked. That subtext is that we denizens of the second half of the 20th century and the first half of the 21st are the only people who have ever confronted the realities of a diverse and dynamic society. Our ancestors, we are often reminded in these conversations, often in a rather romantic and nostalgic way, lived in small, homogeneous communities, defined in many ways by their lack of ethnic, linguistic, religious, and cultural diversity. But that's not entirely true. It was, and one should point out still is true in some instances, though not to the extent some would have you believe, true in rural communities. But for those who have lived in cities, even in the very distant past, diversity remains the rule of the day. In fact, since historically people have lived in vast multi-ethnic, multinational, and multilingual empires, not nation states, the capitals and large cities of those empires have arguably been more diverse in many instances than similarly placed cities today. 10th century Baghdad was likely more diverse than, say, modern Copenhagen. Those cities, those bubbly melting pots of humanity, are the only thing that's different is that today the majority of human beings now live in cities. And Alexandria, which is the star of this evening, is one of those cities. There we go. This is Alexandria, the year Cavafy was born. Konstantinos Petru Cavafy, who is known to the world as C.P. Cavafy, was born in Alexandria in 1836. So to situate him, he was born during the American Civil War and died between the First and Second World War. And for the record, he did not die an old man, just to give you some leverage there, some context there. At the time, Alexandria was part of the Ottoman Empire, though in Cavafy's lifetime, it would pass into British control. Alexandria was, as it had been for millennia, one of the great melting pots of the Mediterranean world. A city of Greeks and Copts, Arabs and Jews, Italians, French and British, of Orthodox Christians, Catholics, Muslims, a city where languages overlapped, identities blurred, and people lived next to and among others all the time, shaping their own self-understanding in relation to that difference. Yet, even for diverse Alexandria, Cavafy was from a particularly international family. His family was actually both on his mother's and father's side from Constantinople, part of the elite Pharaonite Greek community, which had not only been influential in the Byzantine times, but had maintained their influence and wealth during the Ottoman period. And his father held both Greek and British citizenship. Thus, when Cavafy's father died in 1870, when Cavafy was only 7, the family settled in England, and this is St. Sophia's Church in London. Settled in England, where they lived between London and Liverpool. As a result, Cavafy's linguistic identity, an important thing for any poet, was not a simple one. He spoke English and Greek with equal fluency throughout his life. And while he complained endlessly of being bad at French, he did learn the language at school, and by all accounts was fluent. And it's kind of frustrating to hear him complain about his French when you see how good it is. The family was forced to return to Egypt, however, in 1876, after the financial panic of 1873 destroyed their import business. But Cavafy's real return to his roots occurred in 1882, when another crisis, the Anglo-Egyptian War, forced the family to temporarily go stay with relatives in Constantinople. There, a young Cavafy, just 19, developed an interest in the history of his family and genealogy, and then, through that interest, by extension, an interest in Greek history. But not just the classical past that had been part of his English education, but the Byzantine and Ottoman one as well, both of which were widely ignored in Western school curriculums. And he came to see this history as a continuous thread, stretching backward and forward and connecting all of us, Greek and not, to the past, to our literal biological ancestors and to sort of our spiritual ancestors as well. It is also in Constantinople during the Anglo-Egyptian War that Cavafy began writing poetry in a systemic way. And thus, it is here we first get a glimpse of Cavafy beginning to think about another aspect of his identity. It is impossible to talk about Cavafy, and here's from some Byzantine stuff. It's impossible to talk about Cavafy, particularly from the perspective of identity, without talking about his sexual identity. Something that has, at various periods, been difficult, particularly as he emerged as sort of the honorary poet laureate of modern Greek. But it is now understood by most that it is key to understanding his life and work. Cavafy lived at the beginning of what can now be considered a modern gay identity and community, as we have come to understand it. And primarily through his lifelong friendship with the English writer E.M. Forster, was connected to what was an emerging international artistic network of gay men. But this scene was very much concentrated in Paris, London, and Berlin. The social realities of the Mediterranean world were different, though I would argue the legal realities of the Ottoman world were actually much better than in England, and we can talk about that if you'd want later on. But nonetheless, this Mediterranean world did provide spaces, social, geographic, and imaginative, where same-sex desire between men, and we're always talking about men, I think, when we're talking about these sort of public evidences, could be lived. Alexandria, where Cavafy would live the rest of his life after the Anglo-Egyptian War, with its ports, cafes, rented rooms, and transient population, was one of these places. And Cavafy's poetry is filled with these spaces: hotel rooms, narrow streets, fleeting encounters, and remembered bodies, reminding us of the ways in which different worlds can exist alongside each other in the expanses, both geographic and psychological, of large cities. There are hidden worlds in cities, places, people, and experiences not so much out of sight, but out of our sights. These images are invoked in the poem Days of 1903. And the way I've done this is I will read out the English, but if you can read the Greek, I've put the Greek on the other side for those who have some modern Greek, or not modern Greek, and you can give it a try. I never found them again, all lost so quickly. The poetic eyes, the pale face, in darkening streets. I never found them again, mine entirely by chance, and so easily given up, then longed for so painfully. The poetic eyes, the pale face, those lips, I never found them again. Cavafy does not treat his desires as marginal to Greek culture, which was not in itself unusual. Many educated men in the 19th and early 20th century were trained to look to ancient Greece as a cultural reference point. Classical education was standard among elites in Europe and North America, and so for those men looking to understand their own desires, the Greek past offered language, stories, and precedents that modern society denied them. Beginning in the middle of the 19th century with the German Karl Heinrich Ehrlich, men seeking to understand and describe their desire for other men, not just as a behavior or an urge, but as a way of being, i.e. the way we came to understand modern LGBT identity, turned to the Greek past as historical precedent. And if you're interested in this, the work of David Halpern and Sebastian Matzner are the places to go. But what makes Cavafy different is how deeply and deliberately he uses Greek history to think about his identity and the pieces of the past he chooses to use. For one thing, he repeatedly turned not to the classical world, but to the Hellenistic and Byzantine past, periods where Greek culture were already spread across empires, shaped by migration, mixture, and constant change. These were unstable times, marked by declining empires, shifting loyalties, and uncertain moral boundaries, times that might seem familiar both to Cavafy and us. Cavafy was also, in his own way, deeply Greek Orthodox, and he invokes the Orthodox images and culture in ways that Western Phil-Hellenes likely wouldn't have even been able to imagine. Even when he was skeptical, ironic, or distant from religious institutions, the moral imagination of Eastern Christianity, its sense of history, memory, and human complexity run through his work. Taken together, Cavafy's sexual identity and his international diasporatic Greek perspective sharpened his historical and literary vision. As someone whose desires could not be openly affirmed by the dominant moral order of his time, Victorian respectability and religious conservatism, and who lived his life between languages, empires, and cultural worlds in an age of increasing nationalism and the glorification of the nation state, Cavafy was uniquely attuned to figures on the margins of history. This all matters because Cavafy's poetry does not emerge from a fantasy of Greek purity or continuity, even with its deep admiration for all things Greek. It emerges from entanglement, from living as a Greek in places that are not Greece, even in an age when there is a Greek state, from inhabiting a culture that was ancient and prestigious, but also marginal and conquered, and perpetually negotiating its place among others. Cavafy does not write epic poetry celebrating heroic origins or national destiny. Instead, he wrote about failed kings, minor officials, forgotten lovers, compromised emperors, and marginal figures, standing at the edge of history and watching. He was fascinated by the moments of transition, when the old order is dying and a new one is emerging, and no one is quite sure who they are supposed to be anymore. Think of poems like Waiting for the Barbarians, one of his most famous in English translation. When the arrival of the other, the barbarian, right, the sort of wicked other, is anticipated only for the speaker to realize that without them, the society in question has no idea of what to do with itself when the barbarians don't arrive. Why are the streets and the squares emptying so rapidly? Everyone going home, lost in thought. Because night has fallen and the barbarians haven't come. And some of our men just in from the border say there are no barbarians any longer. Now what's going to happen to us without barbarians? Those people were kind of a solution. And this is only one example. There's Ithaca, his incredible retelling of Odysseus' journey home, likely Cavafy's most famous poem, which reminds us that journey, the encounter with difference, danger, and delay, is more formative than the destination. Or the historical poem set in late antiquity, or the Byzantine world, not in the classical world, where Greekness survives not by dominance, but by adaptation, memory, and irony. This is what I mean by a cosmopolitan Hellenism. For Cavafy, Greek culture is not something you defend in drawing tighter boundaries. It's something you practice by reading, remembering, loving, desiring, and thinking about history. It's something you use to explain your own experiences in the world, but never in isolation. It's something that can survive being in the minority, being changed and merged, because it does not depend on power to justify itself and cannot, in fact, really exist in isolation. Importantly, Cavafy never pretends that coexistence is easy. His poems are full of regret, longing, miscalculation, and moral ambiguity. Living among difference for him does not produce harmony by default. It produces friction, but it also produces depth, ethical depth, moral depth, historical depth, emotional depth. And this, I think, is where Cavafy speaks to us most directly. He refuses both the fantasy of total assimilation and the fantasy of total separation. He shows us that what it looks like to live with others while remaining ourselves, to accept impurity without abandoning meaning, and to find dignity not in triumph, but in clarity. Cavafy's cosmopolitanism is not utopian. It's cosmopolitanism for grown-ups. It recognizes that people will disappoint one another, that cultures will clash, and that power will always intrude. but it also insists that retreat into nostalgia or purity is not a solution, it's abdication. To read Cavafy today is to be reminded that pluralism is not a 21st century commodity, that people have always had to live with difference, and that the question of how to live with difference is not new, it's perennial. Cavafy does not give us answers in the form of programs and policies. He gives us instead is something arguably more valuable, a temperament, a way of being Greek, but also of being human that is historically connected, morally alert, ironic without cynicism, and open without naivety. And that, I think, is why he still matters. Not only as a poet of Alexandria or modern Greek literature, but as one of the many guides we can look to on how to inhabit a world that is older, messier, and more interconnected than we sometimes like to admit. Thank you. I have a question for you, if you... We'll start there. We are currently at the museum a little bit, we are fully invested in Homer this year because of the Odyssey movie. So if you wanted to talk a little bit more about Homer sort of as a way in which native Egyptians engaged with Greek culture, I'd be interested in that, certainly.
Okay. So Homer, I mean, there was a lot of Greek literature, increasing through time. By the time you got to the Hellenistic period, there are these Hellenistic poets and whatnot. But interestingly, Homer remained the text that everybody learned Greek through, which is kind of weird because Homeric Greek is not the Greek that people spoke or learned. I mean, Homeric Greek is this has its own dialect, which is not related to the Koine Greek, which is developed in the Hellenistic period. And when people are writing, when they're actually writing, documentary texts, letters, and things like that, they're writing in Koine Greek. It's somehow they're learning Greek through this archaic text. I suppose it would be like, learning English through Shakespeare or King James's Bible, and then writing modern English somehow, because so it's a weird kind of interaction, and yet it's what everybody learned from it. It was the standard text. I mean, students all over Egypt and presumably all over the ancient world were essentially learning, copying, memorizing bits of Homer.
The school texts that people... That happened in Russia, though, I understand. There's a group of Russians, particularly in the provinces, who learned English through Shakespeare. So you can occasionally... There are people in their 50s now, you'll occasionally run into some provincial Russians who learned English from Shakespeare.
Yes. Hi, I have a question for you about the continuity.
I'll bring you the microphone.
Hi, I have a question about the continuity of Hellenic culture in Egypt. You mentioned Hellenic culture was there, and there were Greek speakers and Greek people in Egypt during as late as the Roman Empire. What happened after the Arab conquest in the 7th century up until the Ottoman Empire? Whether there was a Hellenic presence there. Is there any information?
I mean, certainly, I can start, and maybe you can pick up. So, with the Islamic conquest of Egypt in 642 CE, the Greek, the administration, the elite of Egypt wrote and presumably also spoke in Greek. And in the early Islamic period, the administrators of Egypt under the early caliphs were also continuing to write and read in Greek. It's I think the last Greek documentary text dates to around 799, 800 CE. But in church documents, for example, the Coptic Christian Church, they're writing documents and speaking in Coptic, the latest form of Egyptian. But they're also, they all know Greek. I mean, all the basic texts are in Greek. That's where my knowledge takes me.
So you have the Patriarchate of Alexandria, which is one of the 5 ancient Eastern patriarchates, is culturally and linguistically Greek. It maintains a consistent presence after the Arab conquest. It's It's still there today. And there is, there's a sort of imported, after the Ottoman conquest, you have sort of imported Greeks coming from other places in the Ottoman world, in the wider Greek world. But there is a continuous community of Greeks that kind of can trace its lineage. Some people, kind of trace their lineage back to the times before the Arab conquest. Including the patriarchate, and that continues until the 1950s when Nasser expels the Greeks from Egypt as part of Pan-Arabism.
This is for Dr. Muhs. You mentioned that the earliest Greeks in Egypt were there at the 7th century BC. They were mercenaries. Was there in Greece a knowledge of another country, Egypt, where there were pyramids and all this different culture, or is that something that those mercenaries they were the first Greeks to know about that?
There are references to Egypt in Homer and in other texts slightly before the 7th century. We don't have a lot of textual evidence from Greece. I mean, Greek language textual evidence, unless you go back to the Mycenaeans and the Minoans, and the Mycenaeans also were in contact with Egypt. So there was this certainly contact went way back with Egypt. I mean, there's like Egyptian pottery and whatnot in Mycenaean Greece going back to the 2000 BCE. But whether the information they had about Egypt was transmitted, we don't really know, because we don't have written texts. We have written texts from Mycenaean Greek, but do they mention Egypt, and were they read by later Greeks? No, because they developed a new writing system.
No, go ahead. My question's about Cavafy. As this kind of cosmopolitan poet, I'm wondering, what role Egypt has in his poetry. Like, what does Egypt mean to him? Does he ever look to the Egyptian past, or is it really kind of like amalgamated into a more global history?
So Cavafy has an interesting relationship with sort of pre-Alexandrian Egypt. So he's very interested in Hellenistic Egypt. He's certainly interested in Byzantine Egypt and sort of Alexandria as a city that has this Greek continuity that actually the second question was about. But he isn't very interested in. There's some ways in his poetry he's interested in sort of pharaonic Egypt. But what's really interesting is we know in his diaries, he's living in London, and he has British friends in the last half of the 19th century when there's sort of an Egypt mania. In the early 20th century, there's sort of an Egypt mania. And we can tell from his letters, he's not terribly interested in it, and he thinks it's kind of silly for people to be interested in fact. So he's not, people try to get him, there's letters where people try to get him interested in pharaonic Egypt, and he's like, no, I'm not interested.
I wonder if I can take the opportunity to ask a question of you about Cavafy. He lived through the time when papyrologists were uncovering all these ancient Greek texts in Egypt where he was located. He was living there at the time that all the great rediscovery of Greek literature through these Egyptian Greek papyri from Egypt was taking place. Do you know if he had any interest or was aware of this?
He's aware of it through his English connections. Like, that's the people he's talking to about the discovery of the papyri of the he's connected with people who are connected to the British Museum, and he's interested he's being made interested in it by these English connections of his, which is a sort of interesting thing. So he's living in Alexandria, working as a clerk in a British government office, And in some ways, for someone who's obsessed with history, the sort of archaeological boom that's happening around him doesn't penetrate him in some ways, which is I think, very interesting.
I have a question about Cavafy. What was it like for him to be living as a Greek with a British passport, but then also an Ottoman passport during World War I? And how did he view that world, and how did that world view and interact with him, since he'd be sort of playing on, both sides of the war?
So Cavafy actually didn't have a British passport later in his life. At 21, he had to give up his British passport. He hadn't lived in Britain long enough. And most at that point in sort of the early 20th century, through a host of kind of complicated legal things, many of which still haunt people today, by the way, as they go to get Greek citizenship by descent, many of the Greeks living in Alexandria were granted Greek passports, which is actually what Nasser then later uses to expel the Greeks. So Cavafy, by the time of World War I, actually has a Greek passport. And he's working for the British government. He's very much sort of on side with the British and part of the British Protectorate and a supporter of the British Protectorate.
I'm curious to hear both of your perspectives on religion, where Greeks were coming over to Egypt. Were they rejected religiously? Were they accepted? Was there conflict, or did everyone just kind of get along? Or is that a loaded question?
I'll start with, so the issue of Greek and Egyptian religion in Ptolemaic Egypt. I mean, before that period, the Greeks, they had a polytheistic religion. The Egyptians had a polytheistic religion. One of the ways they accommodated each other was essentially through identification. And we see this very early on, what people say, the Egyptian Zeus is, or the Egyptian god Amun is Zeus. And so they would just basically say, no problem, because, we understand your God is our God with a different name. In the Ptolemaic, of course, not everyone agreed with this. I mean, there were probably as many different forms of concepts regarding religion as there are today. But in the Ptolemaic period, it got a lot more complicated because, for one thing, the Ptolemies attempted to create a sort of religious syncretism. They inserted themselves into the Egyptian pantheon as divinities. They created these syncretic gods, Serapis. They adopted Isis as a Greco-Egyptian goddess, alongside purely Egyptian gods and purely Greek gods. I once described the way that the Greeks and the Egyptians interact in Egypt as you would have religious colonialism, where the Greeks are bringing their gods to exist in Egypt, set up shrines to them. Syncretism, where they identify each other, and some Greeks actually took to worshiping Egyptian gods in their own way. So it was extremely complicated and pluralistic, and there have been literally hundreds of books written on this, attempting to untangle it.
The Abrahamic religions always get along with each other, and there was no problem. So the history of, certainly after the Ottoman conquest, right? So there, and really even from the Arab conquest, it's complicated. And for the most part, by the continued existence of a Coptic community in the Patriarch of Alexandria bears testimony to this. Islamic rulers respected the religious autonomy of people of the book, of Jewish and Christian communities in their territory. There were extra taxes associated with this. There was some political and economic disability associated with not being a Muslim, both in the Caliphate and in the Ottoman Empire. But for the most part, the religious freedom of those communities was respected. And really modern Greek identity, as Cavafy would have known it, right? And it's I think, the modern Greek state, even just slightly earlier, understands it, is really this combination of Greek language and Orthodox Christian faith. And those kind of two things together are kind of what makes someone a Greek. And certainly in the Ottoman context, where people are being politically identified, that the Philip system identifies you not by the language you speak, not by any sort of ethnic ancestry, but by your religion. So to be Greek Orthodox, to be in communion with the Patriarchate of Constantinople, is to be a Romanoi, which is sort of modern Greek identity. So Cavafy lived in, I would say, a world that was an Alexandria that was more religiously tolerant than the Alexandria of 1967, right? 30 years after his death. And that's really because of the rise of nationalism, of pan-Arabism, of fundamentalism in the Islamic world, and sort of imported fundamentalism from the Christian West.
Okay, and we have one online question for Dr. Muhs, which reads, you mentioned tax breaks for teachers, would that we had those now, and that the Ptolemies encouraged teachers of Greek in the countryside. There is a mummy portrait, granted Roman period, with a text that describes a young woman as a grammatike. I'm going to say that. There was controversy over how to translate this word in this context, either that she was a teacher or a woman who could read and write, i.e. a literate woman. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Do I have any thoughts? I think you could go either way. I mean, probably in the term grammatikos is a teacher of Greek. I can well imagine a woman teaching other women Greek, because you wouldn't send women to study Greek with men. So that seems plausible to me. There may be other interpretations.
If I don't see any other hands in the next few seconds, I think what we'll do is I'll ask you to join me in thanking our two speakers again. I think this is great to see.